Hello, welcome to Only in Illinois, your weekly recap from Reboot Illinois. I'm Madeline Dubeck here with Matt Dietrich, and this week we want to talk a little bit about the crazy things we're doing to our children in Illinois by not really updating the way we fund schools for many years and kind of changing the standards that we expect our schools to achieve. So one thing that hasn't really been talked about very much, I don't think, is the fact that part of the grand bargain included an attempt to change the school funding formula in Illinois, which has been out of whack for about 20 years and hasn't been updated for 20 years. And things have gotten so bad, particularly in southern Illinois, that recently a group of school districts banded together and filed a lawsuit against the state from more than a dozen.
Yeah, there were 17 plaintiffs, 17 different school districts, and they ranged from Peoria County to the north, all the way down toward the Metro East area in St. Louis. So mainly in central and southwest Illinois. These are smaller districts. They tend to be rural or very small town. And the foundation of their lawsuit is that the state is violating the state constitution by the way it funds education, because the Constitution says that every child is entitled to a, quote, high quality education. And for a long time, there was no definition of what high quality was. That changed in 1997 when the state enacted some actual standards, and it changed again in 2010 when the state adopted Common Core as, you know, these are the standards and these are the benchmarks that we need to hit. There were a couple of problems, though. The state made these standards, but it costs more to get students to meet those standards, and the state never provided any money to do that.
Right.
The other problem is the way funding is set up in Illinois. School districts are very heavily dependent on their local property tax wealth. And
there isn't a whole lot of that in these downstate communities.
Right. And what they're saying is, you know, we don't have the ability to generate more property tax revenue.
Right.
And the problem that they've seen is that state funding per pupil has actually gone down. And in their lawsuit, they use the 4 years from 2011 to 2015, and they talk about how state funding went down during that time, and they were forced to try to make that up on their own. Now, a lot of the affluent school districts in the state had no problem doing that.
Right.
But one of the aspects of this lawsuit is that the affluent districts can afford to do that because, number one, they have the property tax wealth to go after, and number two, their school budgets are not very dependent on state funding. There's a chart that is in the lawsuit that has the 17 plaintiff school districts, and it lists their per pupil revenue, and then it's got 16 of the most affluent districts in the state listed and their per pupil revenue. And you know,
There's
you're talking
$20,000 or more difference in some cases.
and you're talking literally half as much per pupil or less for the less affluent, for the plaintiff districts.
Right.
And so the numbers are very striking. And what you also have to consider, like I said, is that these districts get 50-60% of their per pupil funding comes from the state. You look at districts like Winnetka, 2% from the state. LaGrange, suburban LaGrange, 7%. Hinsdale, 4%. So they get very, very small amounts from the state. What happens when every time they've tried to redo this funding formula is the affluent school districts don't like having money taken away. The residents in those districts are paying a lot in property tax already,
Right.
and even though it only makes up 2% of their overall school budget, they're still paying into that through their income tax. So this is the problem that's come up over and over again. There is the Governor Rauner commissioned a
School funding formula group.
right, and they worked for months and months, and they came out with a report in February that had 27 different different recommendations. Right now, though, there's been nothing but arguing back and forth about it. There still seems to be some progress on it, but this was supposed to be part of the grand bargain in the budget.
Right.
And it's kind of come off the rails too.
There are bills that would make some changes and address this, but we just don't have any sense
Right.
of whether it's going to move this year. But this is kind of the big thing that I think of when I think of the classic argument that always seems to tear Illinois apart, which is you have the city schools in trouble and the suburbs not wanting to do anything, and
Right.
downstate not wanting to do anything to help address that, and then you have the suburbs not wanting to help take care of things downstate, and downstate truly suffers. I mean, you have, it's nothing for a school in the suburbs to have an iPad, for instance, for every student. It's, probably unheard of in a lot of these districts
Right.
in this lawsuit.
Yep.
And you have huge class sizes, which makes it very difficult. The one thing that's kind of leveled out in recent years, I think, is the numbers of low-income students in a lot of these districts are starting to, even in the suburbs, increase. And so that might help, and then the other thing that might help is this concept of what lawmakers refer to as hold harmless, where you try to make things up without taking away
Yes.
from different pieces of geography.
If Illinois had a spare few $100 million,
Right.
they could do that. You could set aside, you could make sure that you hold harmless all the districts that are going to potentially lose state funding, so that they can sort of brace for it and it's not hit all at once. And that way you can bring up the districts that really need it. A couple of terms you need to remember that you're going to hear. This is going to go on. This is going to
Yes.
go on for months. And a couple of terms that you should keep in mind that you'll hear a lot are, one is evidence-based. And this is what Illinois has had for education funding for years and years. Illinois established the foundation level funding. And that's the amount that
The minimum.
that every student, that right now it's $6,119. So in other words, what the state is saying is it's going to cost $6,119 to educate a kid. Boom, period, the end. Per kid. What the evidence-based model says is there is no one number that applies to every kid in the entire state. You have to go through and you have to look at every district, how many kids there are low income, how many kids there are disabled, how many kids there are English as a second language. All of these things cost more.
Does the school offer early childhood education? Those kinds of things, because they should, and those kinds of things are what should be part of the measurement.
And the Rauner Education Commission, when they came back with this report, they had 27 recommendations for smaller class sizes for the lower grades, longer school days, all of this stuff, which is great. It all works. Everybody agrees. Problem is, it also costs money. So you're going to hear a lot about when you hear evidence-based. That's what it means. It means don't just take a number and attach it to every single kid. It means look at every district. What is the special need of that district or the special needs, and how much is that going to cost
take to get
per
there?
pupil to meet certain specific goals, which we've had since 1997 and 2010.
Because every kid should have the ability to have the possibility of achieving a certain level of education.
And that's
That
one of
is
the,
what we do not have in Illinois right now. And you and I and lots of education advocates for years talk about how we can't have a situation where, what a kid achieves depends on what zip code they happen to live in.
And that's a good point, because in the lawsuit, one of the other points, there's one point that violates, I believe it's Article 10 in the Constitution, that guarantees a high quality education. But there's also a clause in the Constitution that guarantees every citizen of Illinois equal protection under the law. And what you just said, Madeline, about every student should come out of school with the ability to, in this case, what the lawsuit says is, with the ability to apply to public universities in Illinois, for
Right.
example. And what it says is, because we have this haphazard way of funding and we are giving low quality education, or not the high quality that we promise, these kids from these districts are not given the same protection. They're not given the same ability to then go on to,
And
as
be
the lawsuit
accepted at
says,
a public
at a public
university.
university. So, but you know, the evidence-based model, that's a piece of jargon that you hear all the time over and over again.
Right.
And that's really what it means. It means don't just slap a price tag on every kid, whether they're in Winnetka or in Metropolis. It's going to be different depending on what their needs are. There's another word that comes up a lot too that you'll hear, which is proration. And this has been a big problem too, because you know, we have this foundation level of $6,119. The state never manages to meet that. They always are short on that. So what happens when they're short is they prorate everyone's state share of the funding. So everyone's goes down, and it sounds fair at face value. You know, Winnetka's going to lose
The same amount.
the same amount as they do in Metropolis. But in practice, it's not, because they can make up their money so much more easily in affluent areas anywhere, whereas you leave like these 17 plaintiff school districts, they can't do that. And there's evidence, and they show in the lawsuit how, you know, over the 4 years from 2011 to 2015, they had a net loss per student because the state funding went down and they could not keep up with their local property taxes. Whereas the 16 wealthier districts that they cite in their chart, their funding per
Way
pupil
ahead.
went up a couple $1,000 per student.
Right.
So it's a big problem. It's something that easily, I would think, could be solved and it's being worked on now.
Yep.
And it was part of the grand bargain, but you're going to hear a lot about it. So keep those few terms in mind.
So those are the ABCs of school funding and school funding attempts at changes in Illinois. So that's it for this week's edition. Thanks for watching. We'll see you on the next edition of Only in Illinois.